and welcome to a short video introducing us to the model of negotiation known as principled negotiation. Principled negotiation was developed by Roger Fisher and others from the Harvard Negotiation Project and was encapsulated in a very small, very readable and very best-selling book, Getting to Yes. The key to principled negotiation was rejecting the idea of fixed-sum thinking that we associate with positional negotiation, where it's a zero-sum game. For every pound that I earn, it's a pound that you must lose. Instead, the architects of Getting to Yes tried to put forward a model of negotiation that was transferable across different contexts and which emphasised mutual problem solving as a way of creating value. And in doing so, it didn't corrode relationships as positional negotiation would do. It actually helped establish and consolidate better relationships. Like a lot of models that have something to be said for them, principled negotiation can be boiled down into some fairly simple key points. There are 4 of them, and they are that we first of all should take an approach that separates the people from the problem. Secondly, we need to focus on interests, not positions. Thirdly, we should try and progress through the use of objective criteria. And finally, that we should be always looking for the creation of options for mutual gain. Now, for the rest of this video, we are going to look at the idea of separating the people from the problem. So, the thing is that the people in negotiation really are the problem, and that is because we are not clockwork robotic droids that respond rationally to everything around us and to the thought processes in our own heads. We are in fact flesh and blood. We are organic and we are prone to all the fallibilities that any other organic creature is on the planet. So we are subject to all the things that can get in the way of having a rational and, as it were, mutually interested decision-making process. So, our perceptions of the situation are formed by who we are, by our life experience up to date, by what we think of the person on the other side of the table, by previous relationship history, and everything else like that. So the way we perceive a situation, the way we frame a situation and the actors in it is going to get in the way of a clear-sighted view of what the decision-making dilemma, what the negotiation is actually all about. As Fisher and others say, many consider it a good tactic not to give the other side's case too much attention and not to admit any legitimacy in their point of view. But actually a good negotiator does just the reverse. We should not be suffering from the tunnel vision of only seeing the world through our own perception, but thinking about what it looks like from the other side's perspective. And indeed, to underline the point, William Ury says, when people ask me what's the most important skill for a negotiator, if I had to pick just one, it would be the ability to put yourself in the other person's shoes. Freeing ourselves from our own perspective and being able to see what the situation looks like, indeed what we look like, from the perspective of the other party in the negotiation. Communication is a big problem. In Getting to Yes, the authors identify at least 3 issues with communication. That is, first of all, that people can be communicating not in order to be understood, but simply in order to be heard. Grandstanding, if you like, playing to the gallery, breastbeating in order to get your own point across, perhaps intimidate your opponent, but certainly not in any meaningful way to have a dialogue. Or it could be that you are simply not heard, that simply the message does not get across. Or it could be that you are heard, but that you are misunderstood. And again, in situations of difference, of dispute or conflict, it's much more likely that there will be a lot of noise around signals that we're getting from the other party, and the way we interpret them is going to be affected by how we perceive them, how we perceive the situation, the medium through which we're communicating, and so on and so forth. Emotions are also at play, of course. We are creatures of emotion, and emotion is often counterpointed with rationality in the human way of thinking. More advanced theories would actually mix the two up. However, it's undeniable that when we're in an emotionally aroused state, we are less likely to be doing all the difficult thinking and processing that requires detachment, that requires a lack of self-interest, that requires a more generous perspective on the situation, and so on and so forth. Again, the authors of Getting to Yes would say that we need to acknowledge emotions in negotiation. We need to be aware of the emotional register of ourselves and of others, but that we should not give in to demands that are made through emotion. And we'll come back to that later. Shapiro wrote about emotion in the sense of the reactions that it gives us. Shapiro said that emotions arouse us in a physiological way, so we start to sweat, we get our heart rate pounding, we feel that bit more agitated, we can sense the sense of perhaps the fight or flight reaction being triggered. But they also affect us in the cognitive way, in that we're much more likely to be subject to tunnel vision, to our narrower prejudices, to the undervaluing what the other party is saying to us if we are in a negatively emotionally aroused state. And if we're frustrated at how things are going, that's much more likely to lead to unhappy thought processes, unhappy framing of information. And again, none of that is necessarily going to be in the interest of a value-creating negotiation. And of course, all of this is subjective. We can only, as human beings, interpret what we see from others around us, but our experience and their experience is completely unique. So there's a limit to how much we can understand. All of this, says Shapiro, funnels through to what he calls an action tendency. And this is being in a prepared state to be triggered, depending on the stimulus, to act or react in a certain way. And if it's in a situation of tension and conflict, that's much more likely to be associated with negative emotions such as anger, such as frustration, and so on and so forth. The next of our people problems is bounded rationality, which very briefly is, of course, about how we interpret a situation is limited by internal factors such as how we frame the decision and such as the limitations on our own cognitive abilities, which really are linked to everything else we've been talking about, but also about external factors such as the time pressure under which we may be under when we are forced with a decision-making dilemma. Again, we are not perfect as human beings, and we are limited in our rationality even at its best. And in situations of processing under pressure, we are more likely to be prone to cognitive biases, putting 2 and 2 together and making 5. And we've covered many of these factors elsewhere in a lot more detail. But this is the people problem, and this is why, according to Getting to Yes, we need to separate the people from the way we look at the problem of what we're negotiating over. So how do we do that? Well, Fisher and others said that in a traditional, as it were, across the table positional negotiation, it's you on one side, it's me on the other, and we're looking at the problem in the middle between us. But, as we've seen, this then puts us in direct opposition to one another. It suggests an adversarial setup. And what can happen then is, through the behaviours, through the how of the negotiation as well as the what, we actually forget about the initial problem and start to really dislike the person on the other side of the table. And that is where the problem is. That is how we need to think about reconfiguring the negotiation into a way that separates the people and the personalities from the issues that are between us. If you think of the example of the conflict in Northern Ireland, not too far from where I'm recording this video, this was a conflict that went down the generations. And depending on your historical perspective, you could say it lasted some 40 years, you might say it lasted several hundred years. The danger was that the conflict itself became so entrenched that people born in the late 20th century didn't necessarily understand why they were in conflict with other communities. They simply knew that they were. And the original reason may have been lost in the mist of time, but was piled up on top with layer upon layer upon layer of hurt, of injustice, of recrimination, of revenge, and so on. And so the conflict becomes much more intractable because we're facing each other in opposition. And the issue itself is buried somewhere under the layers of, as it were, emotionally driven repercussions. Here's what Fisher and others suggest. They say you separate people from the problems by, rather than us sitting across from each other, as it were figuratively, get us round the same side of the table and let's have us both looking at the problem together. That we should be thinking of the negotiation as a problem to be solved in the interests of all of us. They would say that you need to, in your negotiation, and a lot of this comes down to language, objectify the problem. So, for example, we don't talk about you, we talk about the. We don't talk about what you have done to me, we talk about the thing that was done. An awful lot of this relies on language and being a self-aware communicator. We will acknowledge emotion. We cannot discount it. We cannot pretend that it's not happening. An emotion can be genuine or it can be affected in a negotiation. And so, for example, you will acknowledge if someone is losing their temper, but that isn't to concede to it. If someone is losing their temper, if someone is becoming upset or emotional, acknowledge that it's there, recognise it, don't judge it, but don't concede in the face of it either. So suggest perhaps we take a break, allow someone to calm down, for instance. And objectifying behaviour as well, the way in which we use language, the way in which we communicate can serve to either worsen or to improve relationships with the person with whom we are in dialogue. So for example, here's a very simple example. You are a liar says something very damning, accusative and constitutional about the person. You are lying says that, well, at this moment in time, I believe you to be lying, so it's a bit less damning. But we could go further in objectifying the behaviour and say, that is a lie. And you see how we've separated the act that we have a problem with, and that's fine, from the person. And in doing so, we reduce the risk of inflaming the situation through making accusations. But we're not conceding anything in the negotiation either. This is the first of our looks at getting to yes and some of its key principles, and we will carry on now and look at the others in turn.